Okay, and again, this is the review session, so this should not be the first time you've seen this material. If it is, this isn't where you want to start. You want to go back and watch the full-on lecture. We're not going to stop for any videos or any of the special material. We're just going to run through quickly as a last run through. So we have now made it to our last chapter here, our compliance and security in the cloud. So if you look over the introduction, you'll see that it talks about how if you work in compliance or in compliance industries, a lot of resources, time and capital are spent on compliance and security. Of course, security, we know why, because we're trying to keep the bad guys out, and there's lots of things that we need to keep an eye on. But then compliance gets wrapped in here as well, because there are a lot of compliance that has to do with security. And then every or every compliance organization has a number of security controls that you need to watch out for as well. And so, some of the areas that we're going to talk about here when we talk about our compliance is data sovereignty, regulatory concerns, industry based requirements, international standards, and certifications. And so, we're going to talk about the importance and the impacts of compliance in the cloud and explain security concerns, measures, or concepts of cloud operations. Now, I will tell you that when you go into the cloud, you get added layer of support when it comes to these security. So, of course, you have all of the same security things that you have whenever you have a server, you have your data center and the things that you run on each of those machines. You have those exact same security controls and they look very similar. But then when you get into the cloud, you have an added layer because now you've added in this cloud layer, including the cloud service provider, AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, and they're going to help you with your compliance. So when we talk about cloud, just know that we're talking about even more than what you would be if you're just dealing with your own data center. And the CSPs try to make that easier on you, not harder, but there's still an added layer. All right. So then when we talk about identifying the importance and impacts of compliance in the cloud, we want to identify the importance and impacts of compliance in the cloud by meeting or exceeding compliance requirements. This demonstrates a commitment to the customers as well as to regulators. So, in general, compliance with regulations falls into one of the three following areas: activity logging and auditing, encryption and key management, and encryption and key management, and identity and access control. All right. So one of the first words that we picked up in the chapter was data sovereignty. So here's the Wikipedia definition. Data sovereignty is the idea that data are subject to the laws and governance structures of the nation where they are collected. The concept of data sovereignty is closely linked with data security, cloud computing, network sovereignty, and technological sovereignty. So you can read more about this on page 255. Identifying the importance of impacts of compliance in the cloud. So we have some regulatory concerns, including like our local, state, and federal industry-based requirements and international standards. So whenever we do have certain things that are regulated by the country we're in and the state we're in, but then we also have to think about things as far as our industry. And one that always comes up first is PCI. So if you take payment card information, there's certain level of security things that you need to be able to pass in order to operate and to be able to take credit card information. Then, of course, there's lots of different ones that have to do with government and just lots and lots of the compliance. When we went through this the first time, we went through every one of these links. We're not going to this time, but you can go in and see how AWS is going to help you with your compliance. They're going to have these artifacts that are out there that allow you to use the CSP to pull the information you need to prove that your system is compliant. It will also point out to places where you are not compliant so that you can go in and fix it. So AWS, Azure, and Google all have very similar things. I mean, they're more specialized towards their products, But as I mentioned before, the CSP is going to do everything they can do to help you when you're trying to get your compliance. Let's touch quickly on this. I don't think there's going to be anything on net neutrality, but just know that that used to be a big conversation. It's really, you don't hear that much about it anymore. But in short, what net neutrality is saying that an ISP can't slow down or throttle the speed of the internet that they provide so that they can put it on different pricing tiers. There for a while, the CSPs were kind of getting guilty of doing that, and it wasn't a good. It They were making more money out of it. I mean, and everybody should be able to make the amount of money they want, but they were throttling lower tiers of internet and giving some preference, and it just became something important enough for people to stand up and say we need to stop this. So the Federal Trade Commission put some rules in on this as well. All right, an exam note here. The examples list is not an exhaustive list by any means. You're expected to know all. You are not expected to know all the regulations. These regulations are specific to industries, and unless you work in one of the affected industries, you don't need to know the details about them. So we mentioned them as examples, and many regulations that CSPs must work with to introduce the names of regulations that have appeared on the exam question. So the exam will not ask specifics about any of the regulations, but it's important to recognize them by name and know they are regulations. So as we jump into here, so one of the items that we look at here when we're talking about compliance in the cloud, and again, you don't have to know these, but these are good just to be able to recognize, is some Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, or FedRAMP. FedRAMP was established to provide a standardized approach for assessing, monitoring, and authorizing cloud computing services under Federal Information Management Act, or FISMA. So a lot of times, whenever people are talking about FedRAMP, you'll hear them talk about FISMA and FedRAMP, not interchangeably, but FISMA brought around the advent of FedRAMP. So the CSP's desire to sell services to a federal agency must demonstrate FedRAMP compliance, either by earning provisional authority to operate, which is an ATO, from the Joint Authorization Board, the JAB sessions, and then receive the authority to operate, a full-on ATO from a federal agency. So FedRAMP authorizations are granted at 3 impact levels based on the NIST guidelines: low, medium, or high. And these ranked the impact and the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. They could have an organization low limited effect, medium serious adverse effect, and then high severe or catastrophic effect. So again, FedRAMP is around your government type of work. And in here, whenever you're getting something FedRAMP, you have to ensure that you're only using FedRAMP tools to build your system. And then you have to get it, you have to prove that after you've used the correct tools that you built everything in a way that ensured that your application is FedRAMP. All right. Next one here is FISMA. So FISMA is a federal law that requires U.S. federal agencies and their partners to procure information systems and services only from organizations that adhere to FISMA requirement. FISMA requirements are controls identified in NIST 800-53, Revision 4, and NIST 837. Again, you don't need to know these, but we mentioned this previously in the book, so you should be familiar with who they are. Mentioning all NIST documents that detail or relate to federal regulations is beyond the scope of this book. However, if you're interested, there is a link down here and you can come click on this and read more about these. All right, next one, FIPS, or Federal Information Processing Standard. FIPS is a federal standard that details the security requirements for cryptographic modules that protect sensitive information. Then 2 more here, industry-based requirements. So PCI, HIPAA, SOX, MPAA, GLBA. You've probably heard of some of these. If you're getting ready to send kids off to college, you'll read about FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. It's kind of like the HIPAA of education records. So here's some details by each of the CSPs on these. But in short, these are just different ones that you have heard of. If you don't know what any of them are, do take a little bit of time to get to know them. But PCI, as I mentioned, payment card industry. HIPAA is the Healthcare Act. This is what ensures that when doctors have your information, they're not going to share it with an insurance company or share it to salespeople. Their SOX is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This has to do with accounting. So there are different, depending on what industry you're working in, there are different regulations that you have to follow. Here's another one: Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. It's financial institution regulations that stipulates and outlines on the books and record keeping of what is expected out of these institutions. Industry-based requirements, again, like GLBA is Graham-Leach-Bailey Act. It's a U.S. law that reinforces the financial service industry and specifically addresses concerns about protecting consumer privacy. And then here's some more, like on the FTC website, of things that you have to be regulated. And then you have the CSPs of GLBA links are right here, so you can go look at the ones from AWS and Azure. We talked about HIPAA. HIPAA is a U.S. law that established requirements for the use, disclosure, and safeguarding of individually identifiable health information. It applies to covered entities, doctors' offices, hospitals, health insurers, and other healthcare companies with access to patients' protected health information, or PHI, as well as business associates such as cloud service and IT providers that provide PHI on their behalf. So here are the CSP's HIPAA links. And of course, they're going to have more detail on that. So I'd say HIPAA is one of the most known ones besides PCI, where we all know that our information is protected. And we've all, if you've ever been in a situation where you had to sign your HIPAA forms to ensure that you have awareness of how your information will be used. Here's one that's more fun: the MPAA, Motion Picture Association of America. It's the association that provides best practices and guidance for control frameworks to help major studio partners and vendors design infrastructure and solutions to ensure the security of digital film assets. And then Sarbanes-Oxley, this one impacted me a lot. So it's probably one that I know, besides some of the government ones, it's one that I know the most because I was in IT whenever Sarbanes-Oxley came around. And it had a lot to do with after cases like the Enron case, where people were not reporting their books correctly. So there was legislation written to ensure that people were reporting their earnings correctly. So the official definition here is: SOX is a U.S. law that requires publicly traded companies to have proper internal control structures in place to validate that their financial statements are accurately reflect their financial results. Sarbanes-Oxley does not apply to financial institution. It applies to any publicly traded company. Additionally, there are no SOX compliant certifications. SOX is mainly about reporting. So there are SOX reporting requirements. These SOX reporting requirements that CSPs can assist with. So here are the links to the AWS and Azure items around Sarbanes-Oxley. And we have our international standards. So just a few of these where, again, you don't have to memorize these, just know where to go look to know where these are. But you have your CIS, the Center for Internet Security, International Organization of Standardization, or IOS. Then here are the links from AWS and Azure. And then in your ISO, there are lots and lots of ISO standards. And so depending on where you are in the IT industry, you have to read and adhere to certain ones. So the ones that they point out here: information security management standards, controlling cloud-based information security, and protecting personal data in the cloud. So those are three that are specifically around cloud. And then once you can prove that you've had these, you can reach these certain certifications. So certification is a testament to the compliance of standards practices, or regulations by an independent third party. So there are way too many to list, but I have them here broken out by the AWS, Azure, and Google so that you can go in and take a look at the different programs that you can get. Okay, so then now we're going to move more talking about the security. So explain security concerns, measures, or concepts of cloud operations. So we've learned in our last chapter what risk and threats are. So here, one of the threats that we're looking at is a distributed denial of service attack. So in this, you have the computer here. The attacker is running this computer, and out here, he can go to a controller, and from that controller, he can start having um, he can have multiple machines sending messages to this victim. Now, this can get it can be kind of simple or it can get really, really complex. But if you look into the best way to do a denial of service attack is you make this victim think it needs to give a response back, but then you mess up the address so that this guy he's receiving these requests to do something like look at a site or do something, and then it's also working itself really, really hard by trying to think that it needs to give some kind of response back to these, and eventually you'll just spin a machine until it's rendered useless. Now, the first time I think I ever heard about a denial of service attack, Madonna was putting an album out on a certain website for people to go look, and there were people that did this, and that was when that became mainstream media. People understood what a denial of service attack. But if you start looking into some of these, there are some pretty disturbing ones. One in particular, there was a guy that was sending he got into some kind of nuclear facility with his computer, and he was sending the machine that would track how hot um, the the boilers were. I'm trying to think exactly how he did this, but on the machines that were tracking and monitoring these, he was burning the fans out on these computers by sending them these attacks. And the computer was trying to send back things, and it couldn't find where to send them. And they found it in time, but this intent was to have a nuclear meltdown in this plant by destroying the machines that were monitoring that. I mean, that's a pretty disturbing thing to consider that anyone would ever even dream up some plan like this. But anyway, this is, these are some of the types of things that we have to look out for when we're in IT security. And I know that I have mentioned this to you before, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it again. The reason DDoS is studied so much in cloud is because it is a natural DDoS creator. If you are running, say that, look at the same type of diagram, we have this one virtual machine that's trying to do damage to the server. And as you know, it's very easy to scale up. So we could take one machine that's already doing some damage, and then we could just duplicate that by 100, 200, 1,000, and do lots and lots more damage. And you wouldn't have to have that much knowledge to be able to do that. So whenever you look into cloud service providers, they are all of kind of making sure that that is not occurring within their own world. So they have lots of DDoS protection inside the cloud naturally. All right. Another one we want to talk about here is security assessments. So, security assessments is a systematic explanation of an organization's security policies, underlying security controls to see if they are adequate to perform their assigned function. So some of these things here are penetration tests. So penetration test or a pen test is an exploratory or direct examination of a network system to achieve one or more of the following goals: information gathering or vulnerability exploitation. Then we have vulnerability scanning. This is where we probe assets looking for known weaknesses that can be exploited to gain any kind of access. So the goal of vulnerability scans is to identify the potential exploits. Then we also have application scanning. This is scanning for unknown vulnerabilities, manual or a peer review process. Source code needs to be reviewed by peers and tested for best coding practices. So then now we talk a little bit more about our data security. And so some of the categories we have here are public, private, and sensitive. Public, everyone can access. Private, authorized access. Sensitive, need to know only. So right here in our real world example, says originally most organizations based their data categorizations on U.S. government model. Prior to 1982, U.S. government had 5 level data categorizations: top secret, confidential, restricted, confidential, internal, and public. So I'll tell you that doing government work, I still have to take training on these, and they always want to make sure that we can identify what level of security things are. Um, and so, of course, top secret, only people that have to know. Confidential, meaning usually just people within a department know and they can't share it. That's restricted, and confidential, kind of the same, just a little bit less. And then internal means that like everybody in a department can look at something, but you should never look at anything that you don't need to be looking at. And then public means that it's out on the internet. It's somewhere that if anyone in the public wants to be able to see it, they can. Yep. All right, a little more on data security, encryption. So we have a couple of different encryption types and encryption tools. So 3DES, upgrade symmetric key algorithm that has recently been depreciated due to key collision. AES, current standard for symmetric key algorithm used by US government and one of the few FIPS compliant algorithms. DES is a symmetric key algorithm that's no longer used because of the short key length. Diffie-Hellman, asymmetrical key algorithm that is older but still in use. And then now we get into things that we kind of still use. Key length. The length of an asymmetric or symmetric key measures it in bits. It ranges from 56 bits all the way up to 4096 bits in length. So the longer the key, the stronger the encryption, but the more resources required. So a rule of thumb for a key length of the writing of this book is a minimum of 128 bits, but 256 bits are better. So 128 bits starting to show its age due to compute power and reaching the point of being able to decrypt 128 bits in a reasonable amount of time. And then we have RSA. If you've seen those tokens, that was the RSA token. And it's an asymmetric key algorithm that is the pseudo standard used by most organizations. All right. Before this, none of those things were anything that you needed to memorize, but this is a little bit easier, but it is something that you do need to memorize. And you'll see it whenever we go through our key concepts. But the CIA triad, it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So let's jump into this. The C on this, confidentiality. So confidentiality or privacy, it's simple. It's simply the assets that are protected from the authorized assets. So the unauthorized assets are both owned and not owned by the organization that owns the asset that is being kept confidential. So in this, we have encryption. Encryption is the process of hiding data in such a manner that only authorized individuals can read the data. And sanitation is rendering the data unusable, either digitally or physically. You have probably heard the term of redact when it comes to legal documents that have parts of it blacked out. So redaction is a form of data sanitation, meaning removing sections of information if the document needs to be shared. A little bit more on that. If you're taking a disk drive, out of a personal computer, we probably just, you probably just destroy it. Or the funny thing is, probably a lot of people just keep them in the garage or something for years. They get so much dust on them that it's time to throw an old computer away. But if you're doing government work or if you're doing medical work, whenever it's time to get rid of a computer or get rid of a disk, people who know what they're doing can actually go through and pull information off of a disk, even if it's been deleted. So there's certain rules around having to write and rewrite a disk 7 or 8 times over before you can consider it completely sanitized or clean. And there used to be companies that would do this. There probably still are out there, but for the most part, our data is a little more protected, and we don't really keep it necessarily on a computer anymore. We keep it in the cloud, so the sanitation is a little bit easier. All right, the I in our CIA is integrity. Integrity is the second principle of the CIA triad. It's closely related to confidentiality. If an asset is kept confidential, we also need to make sure that it has not been modified or altered. So we need to be able to trust that it's accurate and in the state we expect it to be. And then the A of our CIA triad, availability. So this has to do with our backup and recovery. So backups are mechanisms for making copies of data or assets in such a manner that they can be retrieved should the parent asset become unavailable or damaged or cannot be repaired. Recovery is the other side of the backup. It entails that copying of the data from backup either to the original location or to a separate location. Okay, next concept we're going to talk about here is a breach. So a breach is a confidentiality and in a breach in confidentiality is a breakdown and loss of privacy of data. Depending on either your industry or regulatory requirements, a breach may have to be publicly disclosed. So an ISO 2718 standard requires that a customer be informed if their personal information is lost or leaked outside of an organization or control. Currently, there are no federal laws requiring disclosure of data breaches. However, most states have some sort of disclosure requirement. The disclosure may not have to be public, but the affected individual needs to be notified. So we've all been in those situations where we used a credit card at a place and then later we're contacted that there was a breach. In some cases, our credit card sends us a new card. And one of the ones that I always think of the most, it was probably the biggest one, there might have been a bigger one since then, was one Christmas season, somebody breached Target security, and every single transaction that somebody used a debit card or a credit card at Target that year, or it might have even been that day. It was within a span of a few days, but every single transaction, all of those cards had to be removed. And I got caught up in that one. I was my debit card. I think I bought a printer, and a few days later, I was trying to use my debit card, and it wouldn't work. Turns out that was it was I was caught up in that deal, and they had to send me a new card. All right, and then here's a little real world example: man in the middle attack. MITM is an attack where a third party inserts itself communication stream between two parties, A and B. A and B think they are communicating with each other, but in reality, a third party is intercepting all communications and forwarding them on. This allows third party to view all communications, even alter them if needed. So the key there is to make sure that the transaction takes place and just track and keep the information. And then at a time when you want to use it later, you can have it. I think I've mentioned before there was a gas station in Overland Park that had an attack like this where they had a card reader on a gas pump and it was collecting numbers while people were using it and they would get their gas. It would work just fine. But then a month later, a bunch of credit cards were used, credit card numbers were used without the owner's consent. All right, our next one is applications and infrastructure security. So, whenever we've talked about our network, talked about our infrastructure, our servers. Now we have to think about the application. So the applications that are running on there, and in some cases, this might be the first thing you think of when you think of security, because we've all owned computers, and we know that we have to keep the updates, and some of our software gets updated. But some of the concepts here are audit. So Windows and Unix use Trails, Cloud Trails for the CSP. So I think I've mentioned this before, but we keep trails because you want to keep track of every single event that happens. So somebody signed in, put it in the log. That user went on and created another user. That user went on and created some kind of transaction. You want to log it. So then if later down the road you're looking and you're trying to figure out what happened, you can go back and look at the trail logs and determine what happened and when, and most importantly, by who. Some other concepts here: access, who can get in; authorization, what can they do once they do get in; and then hardening is a word. I brought it up once before, even though the book didn't expressly state it then, but now it's bringing up the vocabulary term of hardening. Hardening is the process of looking at threats against assets and past events to determine a plan of action that will improve the security posture of an organization. So, in summary, we did a lot of things. So, this is the first chapter. We have 2 full pages here of the summary, but a lot has gone into the chapter. You do not need to know every aspect of the chapter. We introduce you to a wide range of concepts and examples to prepare you for subjects that you at least need to be familiar with, but also touch on many other things to meet the needs of a wide range of readers. So we dive deeper into the data sovereignty and the impact of that working on a global scale has. You can't just think of the United States anymore. There are other players that you need to be considered. U.S. regulatory requirements were introduced. These are specific for doing business in the United States and also doing business with federal agencies. Topics include risk management, information security, and information processing and requirements. We then moved to the regulations that were industry based. So we covered a broad range of them, including HIPAA, FERPA, and then the GILBA and Sarbanes Oxley. We also included retention of FINRA and compliance industries with MPAA. That's the motion picture one. International standards were next topic. So we discuss general requirements and frameworks. There's no international body that can impose regulatory requirements, but there are international bodies that provide guidance. So the CIS benchmarks are recognized and universal benchmarks that help ensure information security. ISO is a standard that are the basis of the regulation requirements for other requirements. So you have those ISO standards, and there's many of them. And then the first section wrapped up with certifications and links in the CSP documentation on their certifications to meet regulatory requirements. Not all standards regulations offer or require certification. Then the second section, we started by revisiting what a threat is. We discussed distributed denial of service attacks and provided some resources. Vulnerability was the next topic. We introduced very important CVE database, which is a free database of known vulnerabilities of both hardware and software. Then we talked about security assessments, which are systematic approaches to testing security controls that an organization has in place. Then we moved on to several assessments, including penetration testing or pen testing, vulnerability scanning, application scanning, and we introduced several tools that are critical to the security assessment, including Metasploit, OWASP, Nmap, Nessus, and Kali and Linux. I don't think I went over that on any of the slides, but there are links in your book to show you where these are. They're kind of cool. You can go out and see where attacks are coming from and where they're attacking. So lots of cool little products there. Securing data was a larger part of the chapter. We covered concepts of data categorization. Most organizations use a minimum of 3 categories for data, but some use up to 5 or 6. Then we talked about the CIA triad, and this is one of the most important concepts in the security field. If you plan on advancing further in security realm, you need to be completely understanding of these 3. Data encryption, sanitation were covered. In regard to confidentiality, and then integrity, we need to validate the data, and integrity goes hand in hand with confidentiality. Then the last principle of the CIA triad is availability, meaning the need for backups and proper recovery processes that can be validated. That's key on the validation piece. Whenever we went over this the first time, I told you about a time when we'd be backing things up the tape. Found out years later that wasn't working. So you have to test your backups. You don't ever want to leave yourself exposed. If you're taking backups, you do want to validate that they're working. So then we touched on breaches, which also discussed in the previous chapter. And then moving on from data applications to infrastructure security, we discussed audit, access, authorization, and hardening. Auditing is logging or tracking actions that occur against an asset or by an asset. It's a critical component after a breach has occurred. Access consists of controls that are placed on protecting specific asset. Authorization consists of controls placed on the system as a whole. Rights and permissions play a part in both. And then we finish the chapter with hardening, which is the process of updating or applying changes to an asset to protect against vulnerabilities. So, whenever we talk about going out and making a golden image, um, what we easily do is we say, okay, go get the image. And then there's also a step in there for hardening. And what that means is get the image and then go in and make sure that the image is still hard. Make sure that you check it for all vulnerabilities and update anything that you need to update. All right, so now we're going to go through our exam essentials, and always, as always, like to remind everybody, this is like our little flashcard set. This is everything that you need to know to be on the to take the exam. And so, this is a good place for us to take a look, see what we know, and then identify anywhere that we don't know, and then be able to go back and read more and study up on this. So we'll start here with know what compliance is. Compliance, it consists of actions an organization takes to be compliant with laws and regulations. These laws and regulations come from the industries the organization is doing business with or the state or country that the organization does business in. Know what data sovereignty is? Data sovereignty is important to understand the impact when doing business with an organization. Data is stored in one or more places in the cloud. The data location can have an impact on the sovereignty of the data. Data sovereignty deals with privacy and rights access of third parties. Know the difference in hierarchy of regulations from local, state, and federal levels. It's important to know how conflicting regulations are to be followed. We give examples of federal regulations from a range of federal agencies. These are to serve as an idea of the requirement that exists or the requirement at the federal level. Know the terms and have a general understanding of industry specific regulations. There will be questions on the exam that mention terms that are industry specific. You don't need to know the details of the regulations, but you need to recognize the terms as regulations. Additionally, you need to have a sense of the type of regulations that will be required, whether it's security or reporting. Know what international standards are and the basis for other regulations. CIS benchmarks are used as tests and the benchmarks for regulations at both the international and national levels. Be familiar with the terms that they cover most, pardon me, be familiar with the terms and that they cover most forms of technology used today. Know that ISO is the organization that sets many of the regulations discussed previously, and there are standards for privacy, security, and cloud. Know that certifications are an important standard of regulatory compliance. Certifications are proof that an organization has been able to demonstrate to a third party that they can fulfill the requirements for a regulation. They need to be renewed on a regular basis and require investment of resource by an organization. Know what a threat is and to be able to identify one. Threats come in many different forms, but a DDoS is one of the most common. Know that threats have many different parts, including not just loss or damage of an asset, but also impaired functionality or reduced access, are also threats. Know the difference between a threat and a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities are known as threats that need to be addressed. Know about bug bounty programs from technology vendors. Know that penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and application scanning are primary tools for security assessments. So, penetration test is the process of actively attempting to break in or test security controls. Vulnerability scanning is scanning for specific vulnerabilities, and application scanning is using tools and human testing on applications. Be familiar with the various tools that are used in security assessments. So Nmap is for network discovery, Metasploit and Nessus are for vulnerability scanning, and OWASP is for application scanning. Know the basic three categories for data security and their meaning with examples. So, public is data or information that can be shared with anyone inside or outside an organization, like marketing material type things. Private is data or information that should not be shared outside the organization and should be kept internal. Like things that have company documents, the things that tell your company how to do. And then finally, sensitive is data or information that is critical to be kept confidential, even inside an organization to which access is restricted to personnel who have a need to know. Know the principles of the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So, confidentiality is privacy or keeping data secret. Integrity is the validating of the data. Availability, assets being able to access other assets in a timely manner. Know the tools used for confidentiality: data encryption, encrypting data in a manner that allows sending of data to another party that can be unencrypted and read. Then data sanitation, scrubbing or obfuscating data, which prevents anyone from reading or accessing the data later. Know the tools used for integrity: validation, the process of validating the integrity of data, making sure that data has not been modified since its creation or last approved changed. And then recovery. Oh, you know the tools used for availability, backup, and recovery. So, backup is the process of copying data to a secure location that is separate from the original location. This is where an RPO is critical for backup. And then recovery is the process of copying data from a backup location to either the original location or separate store location. RTO is critical for recovery. Know that the response to a breach is one of the principles of CIA. So, a response may be required reporting, either to a regulatory body or public disclosure. Data may need to be destroyed if it's no longer trustworthy. Communication with a third party may not be trusted anymore. An organization may need to execute its BCP or DR plan. No auditing in its place in application and infrastructure security. Auditing or logging is critical for applications and infrastructure security. It can be both reactive and proactive to events. There are tools provided by CSPs that offer logging not only at the tenant level, but also at the resource level. Know the difference between access and authorization. Access means the rights and permissions to an asset that are part of a larger system. Authorization means rights or permissions to a system as a whole, like a tenant, console, or computer system. No rights and permissions that deny trumps all other permissions. So, permissions are authorizations to perform actions on an asset that have been granted by an asset owner. Rights are either the authorization or permission to perform actions on an asset as a whole. Any permission or rights that apply a deny will trump all other rights or permissions, even if it's explicitly applied later. So, if there is a deny right in there, it is that deny will trump any other type of service. Now we'll take a look at our written lab. Blank is the data category used for press release from an organization that's being sent to the newspapers. That's public. Blank is the data category for salaries earned by everyone in the organization. That would be sensitive. Blank is the data category used for emails sent from HR stating when and where employees can get their flu shots. That's private. Blank ensures the privacy or prevents the unauthorized access to assets. Confidentiality. Blank ensures the validity of an asset. Integrity. Blank ensure the time access of an asset. Availability. Blank are a set of steps that should be taken once an event takes place or steps that need to be taken following a policy. Procedures. Blank is the process of testing the resolved security issue in a patch that was applied to an organization's software, an organization's software. Vulnerability scanning. Blank is the concept that data is subject to the laws and regulations of a particular nation. Data sovereignty. MPAA is an organization that enforces blank regulations, industry based regulations.